Steins Gate Zero is an integral part of the Steins Gate subseries and the wider SciTV franchise at large. Yet despite its importance, it is often incredibly misunderstood, with both diehard fans and scathing critics alike failing to grasp its structure and overall role in the series. In this video, I'll cover how Steins Gate Zero functions in the context of SciTV, as well as how it got to a point that it became so fundamentally misunderstood by a significant portion of its Western audience. Just a disclaimer though, this video contains spoilers for the entire Steins Gate subseries, including all visual novel, animated, and side material content. But with that in mind, let's get started. There are three particular grave misunderstandings that a lot of people have concerning Steins Gate Zero. The first is with regard to how Steins Gate Zero's roots connect to one another. The second is with regard to how the Steins Gate Zero anime connects to Steins Gate Zero's visual novel. And the third is with regard to how the overall chronology of the story works. With regard to the way that Steins Gate Zero's roots connect to one another, there are a number of common misconceptions within the fandom. For instance, a number of people are under the impression that the only two roots that matter are Promise Renashimento as well as Vega and Altair, since they're the only endings you need to go through in-game in order to unlock the true ending, Milky Way Crossing. In addition, there is a decently common belief that Milky Way Crossing is a direct continuation of Vega and Altair. Because these misunderstandings are fairly pervasive, I want to clarify where things stand with regard to the visual novel's root structure. In Steins Gate Zero, all roots are important to the narrative and deeply interconnected. The main principle by which the narrative of Steins Gate Zero operates is a concept that I refer to as worldline recursion, and this is a concept that doesn't even originate from Steins Gate Zero itself. For that matter, Steins Gate Zero is actually largely not an original story. Rather, it is based on three pieces of side material that existed before it: Arclight of the Pointed Infinity, the Epigraph light novel trilogy, and the ending of Annularly Chained Ouroboros. And it is specifically from Ouroboros that worldline recursion originates, a concept critical to understanding virtually all beta attractor field material in the Steins Gate subseries. The ending of Ouroboros features an extended version of the Operation Scald video D-mail, in which the Okabe recording the message outlines that he himself was far from the only person that made that video D-mail possible. Rather, it was the work of countless different iterations of Okabe, or Dead Zeros as he words it, each of whom served as messengers to one another down a ridiculously long chain of world lines. One Okabe served as the messenger to another, who in turn served as the messenger to yet another, and so on and so forth. The Okabe recording that video D-mail just happened to be the final messenger, and he had accumulated the memories and lessons learned by all his predecessors. Ultimately, this part of Ouroboros became the foundation for the structure of Steins Gate Zero's story. The roots we see in Steins Gate Zero are all iterations that happen somewhere along this chain, that occur multiple times even. Past what we see in-game, through some means, the world line shifts to a different one, be it through a D-Rhine, time travel experimentation by one of the competing factions, Suzuha time traveling back from 2036, or something else entirely. Aside from Milky Way Crossing being the last iteration in the sequence, we don't know the exact order in which they occur. But somewhere along the way, these iterations do take place, each with their own lesson or implication foundational to the conception of Operation Scald. For instance, the notion of how to deceive the world, as is outlined in Promise Renashimento and Recursive Mother Goose. Speaking of which, the song in Recursive Mother Goose, on top of being meant to represent deceiving oneself and deceiving the world, is also meant to represent how the story of Steins Gate Zero works in the first place. It's all like a broken telephone game, from world line to world line, from messenger to messenger. That is the whole point of the root, that there are lessons and messages that transcend world lines. On note of the connections between the roots, as mentioned earlier, a lot of people are under the misconception that Milky Way Crossing is a direct continuation of the Vega and Altair iteration, when it is in fact not. Rather, there are countless iterations that take place in between these two endings, each serving as a messenger to another, as is confirmed by SciADV series lead writer Naotaka Hayashi in the Steins Gate Zero Amadeus script guidebook. This is why Kagari dies in Vega and Altair, brainwashed with Yuki's appearance, but is alive in Milky Way Crossing, not brainwashed and with her original appearance. Milky Way Crossing is the culmination of all prior iterations. It isn't simply the epilogue to Vega and Altair. And that is in essence how the Steins Gate Zero visual novel works structurally, like a broken telephone game. But what about the anime? How does the linear structure of the Steins Gate Zero anime work when the whole basis for the visual novel is worldline recursion? And that is where we see the second set of misconceptions common with the Steins Gate fandom. Every now and then, I see a number of comments and criticisms centered around the Steins Gate Zero anime not being a faithful adaptation. Even back in the day, you would see YouTubers like Arcada or Glass Reflection describing the Steins Gate Zero anime as a brilliance muddled by adaptation, due to it supposedly turning a non-linear narrative into a linear story. But all of these people have fundamentally missed the forest for the trees, because Steins Gate Zero's anime is not meant to be a conventional adaptation at all, and I believe it is foolish to think of it as one. As mentioned earlier, it's the Steins Gate Zero visual novel that's an adaptation of existing material. The anime, meanwhile, is functionally a sequel or final route to the Steins Gate Zero visual novel, filling in the remaining gaps in the narrative and concluding the overall story. It is technically still an adaptation, yes, of both the Steins Gate Zero visual novel and also the visual novel's source material, oftentimes adapting the latter more closely than even the Zero visual novel itself. But the anime is so much more than just that, because of the way in which Steins Gate Zero's narrative works. The Steins Gate Zero anime connects to the Steins Gate Zero visual novel the same way the game's roots connect with one another. Zero's anime is ultimately the story of the final messenger, the Okabe who actually recorded the video D-mail from the future. In the Steins Gate Zero visual novel, we see 5 preceding iterations in 5 routes, as well as the very ending of the final one. But we don't actually see the route leading up to the final iteration. We don't see the story or the journey of that final Okabe, just the ending. And that is exactly the gap that the Steins Gate Zero anime fills. It is the final iteration of Steins Gate Zero's storyline and the route for Milky Way Crossing that is missing in the VN. The journey of the Okabe who actually records that video message. The same way that the individual routes in the visual novel have a fair number of common events and overlapping content, the Steins Gate Zero anime has maybe a 65% overlap with the content depicted in the Steins Gate Zero visual novel, Arclight of the Pointed Infinity, and the Epigraph trilogy. It's not wrong to call it an adaptation that reconstructs a non-linear story into something linear, but it nonetheless also serves as the final route for the story of the visual novel because of worldline recursion. It is what completes the overall story of Steins Gate Zero. You cannot finish the story without going through both the visual novel and the anime. I can't get into it for spoiler reasons, but SciADV series content that launched after the Zero anime aired also more or less confirms this relationship between the Zero VN and Zero anime, with content from both versions of the story becoming relevant to future titles. For the SciADV players out there who may need a little bit of a refresher, please see the Steins Gate subseries section of my Anonymous Code Implications video. Now, every so often, I do see some people complain that they wanted a conventional adaptation. And some of you might be wondering why Mages and White Fox did not opt for one. To explain, during the development of the Zero anime, series staff actually did explore the possibility of doing a conventional adaptation. But with such an approach, they could not have sensibly fit in 5 iterations, plus the ending of a 6th, in 2 anime cours. The most they could have done was cover Promised Renascimento in one cour, then Vega and Altair in another, which was one of their preliminary plans. Ultimately, however, those involved decided that doing an incomplete adaptation of an already incomplete story just wasn't worthwhile, so they decided to avoid the traditional adaptation design and instead went with an anime complement. Still an adaptation, but also a sequel. If you hadn't read the Zero visual novel prior, you could still follow along and enjoy the Zero anime story without feeling too lost because it was locked into the point of view of the final iteration. And it's also precisely because the anime was locked into that perspective that VN readers also got a lot of mysteries and unanswered questions addressed. I much prefer this design because it made the Zero anime useful and important to the overarching series. Comparatively, the original Steins Gate anime doesn't leave you with a whole lot of value compared to the VN. By virtue of it being a conventional adaptation, it's just the same story as the original game, but truncated and done worse in quite a few ways with all its cuts and changes. If you intend on going through SciDV, while the Steins Gate anime can be a cool, quick, and very enjoyable way to re-experience the story, there's not much of a narrative reason to watch it. The Zero anime, on the other hand, is crucial to the narrative of the Steins Gate subseries, and of course, to SciDV at large. Like the original Steins Gate anime, it is not an adequate substitute for the visual novel, but it doesn't try to be, and that's what I appreciate about it. You might be wondering what exactly a conventional adaptation for Steins Gate Zero would look like. Look no further than the Steins Gate Zero manga, whose first 4 volumes are dedicated to Promised Renascimento, and the last 2 to Vega and Altair plus Milky Way Crossing, an approach analogous to what the early ideas for the Steins Gate Zero anime were like. And if you've read the manga, you would know that it's a case in point of why a conventional anime adaptation would have been a bad idea. It's an incomplete adaptation of an incomplete story and is of little use to the series from a narrative standpoint. Anyhow, let's discuss the third major set of misconceptions concerning Steins Gate Zero: when exactly it takes place. A lot of people, and particularly a lot of people who've only seen the anime, seem to be confused on the general sequence in which the events of the endings of both stories take place, and a big part of that stems from the propagation of the so-called Steins Gate chronological order, which technically isn't even chronological, but misleads watchers into thinking it is. In this order, the watcher goes through the first 22 episodes of the original Steins Gate anime, followed by episode 23 beta, then the entirety of the Steins Gate Zero anime, and then the final 2 episodes of the original show. And for a first-time watch, this order is truly nothing short of ridiculous. Could you imagine what it would be like to do the equivalent of this in visual novel form? You would play through almost the entire original game just to ditch it halfway through the final chapter to play an entire 30-hour-long side entry you won't understand the relevance of as you're playing it. Or worse, imagine going through all of Arclight and Epigraph before coming back around to finishing the true ending of the original game. In all of these cases, it would be terrible to entirely drop the series midway through, never to finish the original story, let alone its ever so important side material. And I have unfortunately seen this happen before with the anime, where the sense of confusion and tonal whiplash from the chronological order becomes so jarring that people end up never finishing either series. In the first place, were the people who inevitably watched Steins Gate in release order during the 7 years between the original anime and the Zero anime just completely wrong to do so? No, obviously not. With any series, when in doubt, go through it in release order. There may be a few exceptions to this rule, but I believe that 99% of the time, it's what's sensible. In this case specifically, Steins Gate Zero and all the side material it's based on are incredibly reliant on having full knowledge of and context from the true ending of the original story. Really, I think it's bad enough to just be missing the context of the Steins Gate Zero visual novel, since there's so many layers to the Zero anime that you just end up missing without it. After all, the whole point of the story is that it took the efforts of countless versions of Okabe, of countless iterations, for Operation Skull to be possible. Because the anime locks the viewer into the final iteration, you completely miss that if you're an anime only. But at the very least, you can follow along and not feel super lost if you take that approach. To jump ahead without even the ending of the original story though, that is so much worse. Even after the viewer goes back and finishes off the original story, there's too much from what they just saw in Steins Gate Zero that they won't have understood the relevance or importance of. So just generally, though it is technically possible to enjoy the series in the so-called chronological order as quite a few have, I'd heavily advise against it for a first-time watch. But in general, the biggest detriment of the chronological order, as I alluded to earlier, is people not understanding when these events take place. When people describe Steins Gate Zero, they often use all three of these terms: prequel, sequel, and interquel. And from a certain point of view, all three of these terms can be considered correct. It is an interquel because Operation Arclight ties in with the execution of Operation Skuld in Chapter 11 of the original game. It is a sequel because it takes place in 2011, whereas the original takes place in 2010. But perhaps most relevantly, it is a prequel because the entirety of Steins Gate Zero happens before the original Steins Gate, as is made evident by Okabe having already received the Operation Skuld video email in the prologue of the original story. And I think this understanding is crucial to have. People tend to not outright describe Steins Gate Zero as a prequel simply for spoiler reasons, and because naturally, you don't want someone to accidentally go through Steins Gate Zero before Steins Gate. But really, I think prequel is the most accurate term to use when describing Steins Gate Zero. And the chronological order, which puts this prequel after episode 23 of the original, gives viewers a fundamentally flawed understanding of when everything takes place. It's not wrong to refer to it as an interquel, but Steins Gate Zero is nonetheless a prequel that requires its audience to have finished the original story beforehand. But ultimately, why are all these misunderstandings about Steins Gate Zero so pervasive? There are a couple of reasons. First, Steins Gate Zero is fundamentally very messy and disjointed in its design. The messiness via worldline recursion is part of why I like the idea of Steins Gate Zero so much to begin with. It feels so much more unique than the original Steins Gate, which was designed and structured more like a typical time travel work. But at the same time, Zero's design sets it up for confusion. If you don't have prior knowledge of the source material for Steins Gate Zero's visual novel, this concept of worldline recursion might go entirely over your head. It's a story that requires you to go through multiple mediums for full understanding after all. But in the first place, not everyone is interested in every medium. Some are only interested in anime, some are only interested in visual novels. So inevitably, a pretty sizable chunk of the audience will get left missing context. But even from those who go through both, there's a decent number of people who end up not understanding the concept of worldline recursion at all. And that's not their fault. The game is presented in a way that is so misleading, and so many critical aspects to the story of Steins Gate Zero are not advertised by mages, and not made the most explicit in-game for those lacking prior context. Mages doesn't advertise that it's an adaptation of existing side material. They don't advertise that the anime is a sequel to the visual novel. And they sure as hell don't go over worldline recursion in enough detail in-game. It's no wonder that people end up thinking that the Promised Renashimento and Vega and Alter roots are all that matter. It's really not the fans' fault for not grasping Steins Gate Zero's structure, but rather that of mages and the series staff. They set Zero up for confusion. Even those cognizant of worldline recursion end up debating over the D-Rhine that gets received to branch onto the Milky Way crossing route. A diagram in the Amadeus script guidebook suggests that the D-Rhine from Promised Renashimento gets sent to the Okabe of X-Day Protocol. And yet when we think about it from a mechanical standpoint, it's a little hard to make sense of the Promised Renashimento D-Rhine arriving at a point that that specific iteration of Okabe would not have experienced, and in a world almost identical to that of any normal iteration of Vega and Altair anyhow. It would seem like a mechanical inconsistency. When you send a D-mail or a D-Rhine, it's supposed to arrive at a point where the past prior to reception is identical to that of the senders. Obviously, once the world reconstructs after a D-mail or D-Ryan is sent, then past, present, and future change. But it would still have to arrive at a point where the past was identical to the sender's world. And the Okabe of the Promise Renashimento branch did not experience X-Day Protocol, where he received the D-Ryan in the Vega and Altair branch. Of course, some might bring up that there is a difference between the history of the world line of Promise Renashimento and the history of the Okabe who experienced it. After all, there's a lot of intermediate world lines in between that of the phone call branching point at the beginning of the game and the D-Ryan at the end of the Renashimento route. So some hypothesize that maybe, in the past of the Promised Renashimento world line, Okabe experienced the equivalent of X-Day Protocol, thus explaining the discrepancy. But then why would that route be identical to what Vega and Altair would be without having received the D-Ryan? It's rather puzzling. The theory is also more or less debunked in the Q&A section of the Amadeus script guidebook, which also significantly complicates the situation surrounding the D-Ryan. There, the series writers actually vaguely address this point when asked about how the D-Ryan seemingly arrives on a completely different world line from where it's sent. They admit that the Okabe of Promise Renashimento couldn't possibly receive the D-Ryan in the past of that world line because his phone was switched off. And their explanation is that they didn't apply any logic toward which world line received the D-Ryan, and that it worked the way that the Kurisu Death D-Mail and the Operation Scald Video D-Mail worked. That in and of itself is quite vague. You could interpret this as them just letting there be an inconsistency in the story in order to get people to just play Promise Renashimento before Vega and Altair. Or perhaps you could interpret this as the D-Ryan operating by a worldline targeting system, very similar to how the Nostalgia Drive is said to work in annularly chained Ouroboros. For context, the Nostalgia Drive is sent to a set of different world lines, which is why you see it in-game in Okabe's phone history, even in all the alpha world lines. But it is, of course, only truly unencrypted on one particular world line after reaching a certain set of conditions. If the D-Ryan does operate by a worldline targeting system, would that particular iteration of Okabe have been able to figure it out that soon though? It ends up being rather puzzling. Another common explanation I see fans theorize about is that this D-Ryan and X-Day Protocol is not actually the one sent by Okabe in Promise Renashimento, but rather that of a different, unseen iteration, presumably from a world line identical to that of Vega and Altair, even though its contents are identical. Is this actually the case though? Given the content of the Amadeus script guidebook, I don't think this was their intention. But who knows? Either way, Steins Gate Zero is fundamentally a confusing and disjointed mess by design. So it is no surprise that it's so misunderstood, because even those most knowledgeable about the game have a hard time unraveling it. A second reason why Steins Gate Zero is so misunderstood is simply a lack of translations for its source material. The light novel versions of the Epigraph trilogy, as well as annularly chained Ouroboros, remain untranslated. And despite Steins Gate's overwhelming popularity, it seems there is little official interest in translating these titles at all, despite their incredible importance to both the Steins Gate subseries and SAIDV at large. Unsurprisingly then, few end up understanding the origins behind the idea of Steins Gate Zero and the idea of worldline recursion. On that note, it's really only been in the last several years that much of SAIDV has even gotten translated at all. In the old days, English-speaking fans had hardly any translated content to go off of other than the anime adaptations, and that led to some devastating levels of misinformation on both Steins Gate and SAIDV at large. Since most of the anime adaptations in the series cut their respective entries as ties to the wider series, viewers were misled into believing that SAIDV was just a collection of separate standalone stories that just happened to take place in the same universe, rather than parts of the larger overarching storyline that they actually are. Similarly, because of the historical lack of source and side material translations, so many people would claim that the Steins Gate movie was not canon, even though nowadays we know pretty definitively that it is canon. The people spreading that conclusion back in the day were simply missing context of the movie's supplementary material and of other SAIDV entries. And a lot of the individuals who were missing the context of Arclight, Epigraph, and Ouroboros were the ones who made a lot of the popular but misinformed posts and reviews for Steins Gate Zero. This leads me into a third reason why Steins Gate Zero is so misunderstood: the snowball effect. Very much like how Zero is like a telephone game, so too is the discourse surrounding it. One person spreads one misinformed viewpoint to someone else, who then spreads it to another, and so on and so forth. Those who watch the series in chronological order spread the chronological order, and inevitably that reaches more ears. This is why with every post on the Steins Gate subreddit asking about the series' watch order, you always run into a few people in the comments section advocating for the chronological order. This is how they watched it, so that is what they will spread. And with the chronological order, inevitably comes a fundamentally flawed and misinformed understanding of Steins Gate Zero and the overall series chronology. But worse than the misinformation spread by those in comment sections and online forum posts is those spread on YouTube. Almost all of the top Steins Gate watch order videos put out there propagate the chronological order, which, as I mentioned earlier, isn't chronological. The biggest and most popular of them all is truly the bane of my existence. It is 85 seconds long, AI voiced, and in its runtime, it advocates for the chronological order and falsely denotes that the Steins Gate movie is non-canon and skippable. The worst part of it all is that in the description, the uploader mentions that the intent is to help people understand the sequence of the episodes or seasons in the best possible way, even though this is not the right sequence of events at all and gives viewers an incredibly flawed understanding of how the story works. It's so much misinformation to spread to 141,000 people in such a short amount of time. It's truly devastating how something with so little thought put into it can have such widespread impacts on an audience's understanding of a work. When so many videos spread misinformation of this sort, it's no wonder that so many people end up misunderstanding Steins Gate Zero entirely. Even historically, and outside the bounds of watch order discourse, a lot of the most popular videos on Steins Gate Zero have little tidbits of misinformation within them. And that is one of the biggest reasons I decided to start my own channel. A huge sense of frustration with the existing coverage of the series. In terms of SciTV at large, very few YouTubers had covered it at all. And while there were a decent number of YouTubers who had covered Steins Gate itself, almost all of them only had experience with Steins Gate itself, and often only the anime. Thus, they were missing too many layers to the story in their analyses. When it came to Steins Gate Zero specifically, there were especially so many videos that frustrated me to no end, because regardless of whether they were positive or negative, there were so many critical story details that the video creators either got wrong or just neglected to mention. Not a single one of the biggest Steins Gate Zero videos out there mentions that the visual novel itself is an adaptation of existing material like Arclight and Epigraph, and not a single one of them mentions that the anime is a sequel to the visual novel. For one of the more positive videos, as I mentioned earlier, Glass Reflection made a video on Steins Gate Zero's anime, referring to it as a brilliance muddled by adaptation, when it was not supposed to be a conventional adaptation, but rather a sequel. And while there was no ill intent there, of course, this video still perpetuated an incorrect understanding of what the Zero anime was supposed to be. Then, in terms of the negatives, there's quite a few videos out there that have blamed Steins Gate Zero for things that, frankly speaking, it was not responsible for at all. And in doing so, these videos have completely failed to convey the origins of Steins Gate Zero, have failed to convey Steins Gate Zero's overall role in the series, and have failed to convey how the Zero anime and visual novel are related to one another. This can be seen, for instance, in the 4-part video essay series by Trixie, formerly known as Digi, as well as in the Steins Gate Zero videos by Weebjail. Both creators blame and criticize Steins Gate Zero for things that were established by side material long predating Zero, some even predating the original Steins Gate anime. In Weebjail's currently available iteration of his many negative Steins Gate Zero videos, he has painted it as something written by people who did not understand Steins Gate, even though that is, of course, abhorrently untrue, given most of the writing staff are and were veteran writers for the series prior to Steins Gate Zero. This of course includes Masashi Takimoto, who wrote the Epigraph trilogy, as well as SciTV series lead writer Nao Takahashi, who wrote a significant portion of Zero's story and supervised the entirety of it. But when people watch these videos on YouTube, especially those who are not the most well-versed with this series, they end up internalizing and perpetuating those YouTubers' misunderstandings. To be clear, I mean no hate to any of the aforementioned people, because we're all only human. But the snowball effect is truly at its worst on YouTube due to the sheer reach that content creators have. And that kinda scares me. But anyhow, to summarize, Steins Gate Zero is an adaptation of existing side material. The Steins Gate Zero anime functionally serves as the final route for or sequel to the Steins Gate Zero visual novel rather than a traditional conventional adaptation of it. And Steins Gate Zero itself is also best described as a prequel because the entirety of it takes place before the start of Steins Gate. Misunderstandings of these points, along with others, are fundamentally because 1. Steins Gate Zero's design set it up for confusion. 2. Most series side material just hasn't been translated. And 3. The snowball effect from misinformed fans and YouTubers internalizing and proliferating misinformation. With that in mind, thank you for watching. Special thanks to Fasty and Maxi, and I'll see you all around. L. Sai. Kong.